Imagine being buried alive, but by choice. Not in a coffin. Not in a cell. In a network of tunnels carved into the guts of a volcanic island, with the ocean above you, bombs raining down from every direction, and no way out. The air is thick with sulfur. The walls sweat. And somewhere beyond the rock, 20,000 American Marines are coming for you. This is Iwo Jima, February 1945. And what happened beneath that island's surface is one of the most extraordinary, and most overlooked, stories of the entire Second World War. Most people know Iwo Jima from one image: 6 Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi. That photograph became iconic. It became a symbol of sacrifice, of victory, of the American spirit under fire. But there's another story, one that lived underground, in the dark, in the silence, that almost nobody talks about. A story not of the victors raising a flag, but of men who had already decided they would never surrender. Men who burrowed into the earth like something ancient and refused to die. When the American forces landed on February 19, 1945, they expected a brutal fight. They didn't expect this. They had bombed that island for 72 consecutive days before sending a single boot onto the beach. 72 days of aerial bombardment. Ships pounding the coastline. Intelligence analysts looking at the before and after photographs and thinking, there can't be much left down there. They were wrong. Because what they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Japanese General Tadamaki Kuribayashi had spent the previous 8 months doing something that had never quite been done before in the Pacific War. He had moved his entire army underground. Not metaphorically. Literally. Into the rock. To understand what Kuribayashi built beneath Iwo Jima, you have to first understand the island itself. Iwo Jima is not a normal piece of land. It is, in geological terms, barely land at all, a volcanic formation rising out of the Pacific, just 8 square miles of sulfuric rock, ash, and sand so black it looks scorched by something ancient and unforgiving. The ground was warm to the touch. In certain places, steam rose directly from the earth. The island smelled like rotten eggs from one end to the other. It was, by almost every measure, one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. And yet Kuribayashi looked at it and saw something that no American planner had fully anticipated. He saw a fortress waiting to be carved. The general had visited the United States before the war. He had traveled through the country, studied its industry, eaten at its tables, observed its people. He came away with a conclusion that very few Japanese commanders were willing to voice openly: America could not be defeated in a prolonged war of attrition. Its manufacturing capacity was too vast. Its population too large. Its will, when provoked, too ferocious. Kuribayashi understood, with a clarity that bordered on prophecy, that when the Americans came to Iwo Jima, and they would come, because the island sat within bomber range of the Japanese mainland, there would be no reinforcements arriving from Tokyo. No naval support. No air cover. Whatever he built on that island would have to sustain his men entirely on its own, from the first shot to the last. So he built something that the surface could never provide: depth. Beginning in the spring of 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers and Korean laborers began digging. They worked in brutal conditions. The volcanic rock was hard in some places and crumbling in others. The sulfuric gases that seeped through the ground made long shifts underground genuinely dangerous, and the heat emanating from the island's geothermal core turned certain tunnels into something close to ovens. And yet they kept digging. Day after day, week after week, month after month. They dug with hand tools when machines couldn't fit. They reinforced walls with timber and concrete hauled down into passages barely wide enough for 2 men to pass each other. They carved out rooms, actual rooms, for command centers, field hospitals, ammunition depots, and barracks. By the time the American fleet appeared on the horizon in February 1945, the tunnel network beneath Iwo Jima stretched for approximately 18 kilometers. 18 kilometers of connected passageways, chambers, and fighting positions, some of them reaching depths of 30 meters below the surface. What made this network genuinely revolutionary, and genuinely terrifying for the Marines who would eventually try to fight through it, was not just its size, but its design philosophy. Kurobayashi had rejected the traditional Japanese defensive doctrine of meeting the enemy at the beach, fighting ferociously, and dying in a glorious last stand. He had seen how that approach had failed on island after island across the Pacific. Instead, he designed a system built around one core principle: let the Americans come. Let them land. Let them believe they're advancing. And then bleed them from below and from within, from positions so deep and so well connected that artillery and air bombardment could not reach them. Firing positions were layered in overlapping fields of fire. Tunnel exits were positioned to allow defenders to emerge behind American lines, fire, and disappear back underground before a counterattack could be organized. The entire island had been engineered, at an almost architectural level, to function as a weapon. The 72 days of American bombing that preceded the landing, one of the longest pre-invasion bombardments in the Pacific theater, destroyed surface structures, cratered the beaches, and killed a portion of the garrison. But it barely touched the tunnels. The rock absorbed the explosions. The depth protected the men. When the first wave of Marines hit the beach on February 19th and began advancing inland, Japanese soldiers who had been crouching in complete darkness 30 meters underground simply waited. They waited until the Americans were in position. And then the island, as one Marine survivor later described it, seemed to come alive from the inside. The island was alive. But the men living inside it were slowly dying of thirst. This is the detail that most history books skip past, the part that, when you stop and actually think about it, defies easy explanation. How do you sustain an army underground, on a volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no supply lines, no fresh water sources, and an enemy force that controls everything above the surface? How do you feed 21,000 men when the ships stopped coming months ago and the bombs have sealed half your storage tunnels? How do you keep fighting when your body is already failing? The water problem was, by almost every account from survivors and post-war analyses, the single most brutal logistical reality of the entire battle. Iwo Jima had virtually no natural freshwater. The island's volcanic composition meant that what little groundwater existed was either too deep to reach or contaminated with sulfur to the point of being undrinkable. Before the battle, the Japanese garrison had constructed cisterns and collection systems designed to capture rainwater, and had stockpiled reserves calculated to last through an extended siege. But the American bombardment had destroyed a significant portion of those reserves before a single Marine set foot on the beach. What remained had to be rationed with a severity that is almost impossible to comprehend. Accounts from Japanese soldiers who survived describe receiving less than a single canteen of water per day, in tropical heat, while performing the physical labor of combat. Some men went days with almost nothing. Some drank water so contaminated it made them sick. Some, in the final stages of the battle, reportedly collected moisture from the tunnel walls themselves. Food followed the same devastating trajectory. The garrison had arrived on Iwo Jima with stockpiles of rice, canned goods, and dried provisions calculated for a long defensive campaign. But storage was imperfect in the volcanic heat and humidity of the tunnels. Spoilage was a constant problem, and as the battle stretched from days into weeks, the calculations that had seemed sufficient began to collapse. Rice portions were cut. Then cut again. Men who were already exhausted from combat and dehydrated from water rationing were now operating on starvation-level caloric intake. The physical deterioration was rapid and severe. And yet the fighting continued. What kept them going, and this is where the story moves from logistics into something harder to quantify, was not food or water. It was structure. It was discipline. It was a system of command that Kurabayashi had designed specifically to function even as the army disintegrated around him. Officers maintained strict control over rationing. Tunnel sections were organized so that each unit knew its role, its position, and its orders regardless of what was happening elsewhere in the network. Information passed through the tunnels by runner when radios failed. When runners couldn't get through, written orders were passed hand to hand through the darkness. The army was dying, in the most literal physical sense, and it was still following orders. It was still fighting with organization and tactical coherence that shocked the Marine commanders pressing in from above. There's something about this that deserves a pause, because we're not talking about men acting from momentum or panic or simple survival instinct. We're talking about soldiers who, in many cases, knew with absolute certainty that they were not going to survive, knew that no rescue was coming, knew that the water was running out and the food was nearly gone, and still chose, deliberately and consciously, to keep fighting. That choice, and what drove it, is something we'll get into in the next part of this story. But before we do, drop a comment below. Would you have been able to hold that kind of discipline in those conditions? Would anyone? Because that question, the deeper you go into what happened on Iwo Jima, doesn't get easier to answer. To understand why these men kept fighting, starving, dehydrated, buried in volcanic rock with no hope of rescue, you have to understand a concept that doesn't translate cleanly into English. The Japanese word is gyokusai. Literally, it means shattered jewel. And in the military culture of Imperial Japan, it described something that Western military doctrine had no real equivalent for, a death so complete, so total, and so deliberately chosen that it became, in itself, a form of victory. Gyokusai was not suicide in the clinical sense. It was not despair. It was, within the belief system that had been built into these soldiers from the beginning of their military lives, the highest possible expression of loyalty, to the emperor, to Japan, to the unit, and to the idea that surrender was not merely a tactical failure but a moral one. To be captured was considered a disgrace so profound that it effectively erased the soldier from the social fabric of his family and his country. His parents would not mourn him. His name would not be honored. He would simply cease to exist, in every meaningful sense, except as a source of shame. Death, by contrast, death in battle, death fighting until the last possible moment, carried the weight of something sacred. Kurabayashi understood this. And he used it, with a kind of cold strategic clarity, to build a defensive doctrine that was as psychological as it was physical. His orders to the garrison were explicit: every man would fight to the last. There would be no organized retreat, no negotiated surrender, no white flags. Each soldier was expected to kill at least 10 Americans before dying. Not as a figure of speech. As a literal operational directive. The tunnels were designed not just to protect men from bombardment but to allow them to keep fighting long after any conventional military commander would have declared the position untenable. The underground network was, in a very real sense, a machine built for Gyokusai, a structure designed to make the act of dying as costly as possible for the enemy. The psychological warfare dimension of this extended far beyond the Japanese garrison itself. For the Marines fighting above ground, the experience of Iwo Jima produced a specific and deeply unsettling form of combat stress that veterans would describe for decades afterward. The enemy was invisible. You could take a position, hold it, believe it secured, and then have men emerge from a tunnel entrance behind you that hadn't existed the day before. You could watch a section of ground that had been quiet for hours suddenly erupt and fire from a position you had walked past a dozen times. The island gave nothing away. It offered no clear front line, no obvious perimeter, no moment at which you could reasonably feel safe. The psychological toll on Marine units was severe, and it was entirely intentional. Kurobayashi had designed the battlefield to produce exactly that effect, a grinding, relentless, disorienting pressure that wore at the human mind as steadily as it wore at the body. What the Marines could not have fully known, pressing forward yard by yard through that sulfuric rock, was the state of the men they were fighting. They were, in many cases, fighting ghosts, soldiers who were already beyond the point at which any medical assessment would have considered them combat capable, men running on will and ideology in bodies that were failing them in real time. And yet the resistance never fully collapsed. It slowed. It contracted. The tunnel network shrank as American forces pushed deeper. But it never broke cleanly. It frayed, section by section, unit by unit, in a pattern that reflected something deeper than military training, something closer to a collective, culturally embedded refusal to accept that the end had come. The Battle of Iwo Jima was officially declared over on March 26, 1945, 36 days after the first Marines hit the beach. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese soldiers who had defended the island, fewer than 220 survived to be taken prisoner. The American casualties were staggering as well, nearly 7,000 Marines killed, more than 19,000 wounded. It remains, to this day, one of the bloodiest battles in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The flag went up on Suribachi. The photographs were taken. The world moved on to the next battle, and then to the end of the war itself. But the tunnels weren't empty. In the weeks and months following the official end of the battle, American forces conducting mop-up operations continued to encounter Japanese soldiers emerging from the underground network, soldiers who either hadn't received word that the battle was over, or who had received it and simply refused to believe it, or who believed it but had no framework within which surrender made any sense. Small groups, sometimes individual men, continued to conduct guerrilla-style operations on an island that was, by every official measure, fully under American control. They moved at night. They raided supply depots for food. They disappeared back into tunnel entrances that the Americans hadn't found or hadn't fully sealed. They were, in the most literal possible sense, ghosts, men who existed in a reality the rest of the world had already declared finished. The most extraordinary case, and this is where the story of Iwo Jima connects to something almost mythological, involved two men, Yamaguchi Kufuku and Matsuda Lensoki, who were not discovered until January 1949. Nearly 4 years after the battle ended. For years after the emperor himself had announced Japan's surrender on the radio. For years of living inside that volcanic rock, on an island now occupied by the very forces they had been ordered to fight, surviving on whatever they could find in the dark. When they finally emerged and were taken into custody, they were not treated as criminals. They were repatriated to Japan, where they were received not with judgment but with a kind of stunned, complicated respect, men who had taken an order so seriously that they had followed it across the boundary of history itself. There is something in that story that resists easy categorization. It isn't simply a story about fanaticism, though fanaticism played a role. It isn't simply a story about loyalty, though loyalty was at its core. It's a story about what happens when human beings are given a purpose so total, so absolute, and so deeply embedded in their identity that even reality, the undeniable, documented, broadcast reality of defeat, cannot fully dislodge it. Kurobayashi's men had been built, psychologically and culturally, to hold. And some of them held long after there was anything left to hold for. That is not an easy thing to look at directly. It is not comfortable. But it is, in its own dark way, one of the most purely human things about the entire war. Iwo Jima was a battle fought on the surface and won underground. It was a battle where the side that lost, in the end, extracted a price so severe that the American commanders who ordered the invasion openly questioned, afterward, whether the cost had been worth it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reflecting on what the Marines had endured, wrote words that have never stopped resonating: uncommon valor was a common virtue. He was talking about the Marines. But the tunnels beneath that island, the engineering, the endurance, the water rationed to drops, the rice counted grain by grain, the men who kept fighting in the dark long after the world above them had moved on, that was something else entirely. Call it what you want, but don't call it simple. If this story pulled you in and left you wanting more from the history of the Second World War, there's another video coming up on your screen right now, a different battle, a different moment, an equally extraordinary story that most people have never heard in full. Click it. The history goes deeper than most people realize, and the next video picks up exactly where that curiosity takes you. And if you made it all the way here, if you watched this to the end, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories the way they deserve to be told. See you in the next one.